Hello, History 72B. I taught 72A last quarter. Sooner or later, I'm going to mess that up. Spring quarter 2023. I am still looking forward to meeting all of you. I'm still recording these a little bit early, the ones that I can, because I know that I will have some sick time later when it will be harder to keep flowing with them. So don't feel like you have to watch them right now with the speed that I'm putting them up. This is your third lecture, main lecture, not counting the getting around the site. This is your third main lecture in this course, and I've called it, What is a Woman? I've broken the lecture into three parts. They get shorter as they go, partly because they build on one another, so don't panic. The first is the perils and pitfalls of communication. The second is the history of women in history. And the third is problems with tradition and progress. I am going to continue with the idea of meanings in words and communication beyond the literal on the surface meaning. Meanings that often require considerable cultural knowledge to understand. I talked in the last video about the ways that people in the same historical context, who all would define most words in predictable and fairly consistent terms, also derive an additional suite of meanings that are specific to each person from all communication, like this lecture. Sometimes a difference in inflection of the voice in a spoken sentence can completely change the meaning for those in the know. This whole thing can work quite differently in a language other than English. That's part of the point. Sometimes it doesn't matter if people interpret communication in different ways, but sometimes it does. Here's a simple example. If I try to read the sentence on the slide without the tone of my voice changing, rising, and falling, and without emphasizing some words more than others, it's actually fairly difficult. The only way that I can do it is to leave spaces between the words, to disconnect them, and practice. Spouse often wonders who Pat and Kim are. Here goes. Pat likes Kim. It feels a little like the patched together sentences in train stations and airports. I also have to say that I know my voice rose and fell. That's the worst time I've done that particular one. Of course, we don't talk this way. Pat likes Kim. So we indicate meaning by saying exactly the same phrase in different ways. So, Pat likes Kim. Pat likes Kim? Pat likes Kim. But what if we are reading the sentence, maybe in an email? Let's say that your friend is telling you something they think is important about people you don't really know. Your friend introduced you to these people at one point, but you cannot remember who was who. And you don't want your friend to know that you've forgotten. Is there a way to tell from the three written words whether your friend is telling you that Pat likes Kim, or asking you if it's really true that Pat likes Kim, or is pleased and excited by the news that Pat likes Kim? We can indicate the correct interpretation of the sentence by putting marks at the end of the sentence. Problem solved. But that only works if you and your friend have enough cultural knowledge to derive meaning from dots and squiggles. That would be a question mark. So, statement, Pat likes Kim. Question, Pat likes Kim? Excitement, Pat likes Kim. Punctuation, like question marks, actually encodes considerable information in one squiggle and dot. We know that the middle sentence should be read as a question. We also know how to make the phrase sound so that it is clearly a question. We know that our hypothetical friend is asking us something. If we grew up speaking American English, our cultural knowledge lets us derive more meaning from three words. If historians in the future know the punctuation code, they can learn more from our email. More, but still not as much or the same things as in a spoken sentence. Changing the emphasis in the sentence conveys more information. So, for example, Pat likes Kim. Pat likes Kim. Pat likes camp. This time, it's not reflected in the written version. There are different ways to indicate emphasis, and I've put a few of those on the slide, but they are inconsistent and often not entirely clear. So even with end of sentence punctuation, our future historian cannot be absolutely certain exactly how to interpret the question, Pat likes Kim. The more we know about the context in which this sentence appears, the closer we could come to knowing the meaning that the writer intended. Context can also help us in situations where the meaning of the same set of symbols varies over space. Variation in space is linked to change over time. In other words, historical context. For example, at one point in the mid-19th century, after the process of vulcanization had been worked out, both erasers and condoms were made from rubber. And pants are still articles of clothing with 2 holes for legs and 1 for the trunk of the body. Both sets of meanings have a fairly clear connection to one another. Made of rubber at one time, worn on the lower body. They all make sense. However, our future historians still need some knowledge of historical context, or they are likely to go well astray on their analysis. This is true for both words, clearly, but we are going to focus on pants here. Just as a quick story, when I first moved to England, I was in a ballet class and waiting for the class to start, and a rather lovely young woman next to me asked me for a rubber, which took me aback until I realized that what she wanted was an eraser. She was doing her homework. All right, so the differential analysis is true for both words, rubber and pants, but we're going to focus on pants from here on. Pants can and do convey meanings beyond a form of clothing worn on the lower body, and those meanings contain more meanings. The reason that the pants confusion is amusing is that there are very different social reactions to undergarments, which indicate intimacy and should not be worn in public, and outer garments, which are totally okay to have visible, as long as the setting is the correct one. The overlaid meanings require a certain degree of context knowledge, but at least they still make some sense, at least in terms of clothing the body. But what about when a meaning disconnects from any obvious association with the official meaning of the word? I lived in England for a couple of years. When I first arrived, I knew that pants meant underwear, not trousers, but that did not help me interpret headlines like this one. French dictionary says pants to the past. Pants also meant not good or rubbish. The article talks about a new French-English dictionary that includes more words from English than previous ones because of the long-term official protection of the purity of the French language. So I don't know if you look at Europe at all, but we often absorb words from other languages here as well, gestalt, angst. So, but the French have been very picky in the past about preserving French as a pure language. And so their dictionaries have not included those borrowed words. And so when it says, the French dictionary says, pants to the past, that means they're giving up their past practice and doing something new. Communicating through spoken or written language is not a matter of just substituting words for the same physical object, as in our example, trousers or underwear. Words combine with the sort of unconscious cultural knowledge that I started talking about in the last lecture to adopt new meanings that simultaneously seem obvious to the speaker, but potentially illogical to others. Particular meanings emerge in particular historical contexts, and they perform a certain amount of what I call behind-the-scenes work. In the example shown here, the use of pants is intended at one level to add humor to a headline on a somewhat dry topic, like dictionaries. But there is still so much more here. In the headline, the humor is only fully legible if the reader is familiar with nationalist stereotypes circulating in the given historical context and shared by many white British folks. The French are, or were at this time, characterized as stubborn, self-satisfied, and resistant to change. The English were conceived of as modern and adaptable. These British images of both themselves and the French have developed over the course of several centuries, at least. But our topic is not the French and the English, but women and gender. I suspect that you already have an idea that an American English meaning of pants is associated with constructions of sex gender. In the US, pants has taken on an entire collection of meanings requiring cultural knowledge. Some of these have dropped out of use and some have stayed. The formation and fate of words and phrases over time is not just a neutral bit of trivia. Communication both reflects and affects cultural ideas and assumptions. We are going to zoom in on the phrase in blue, to wear the pants in a family or relationship, which carries the meaning of a man taking a dominant position in relation to his partner or family. I found the reading on skirts is the introduction to a rather delightful book. I don't agree with everything she has, but that's normal for historians. But I've been giving this lecture using the to wear the pants example for quite a while now. And the book just came out. I found it. The reading is absolutely perfect and it's quick to read. Okay, to warn you before we move on, the next slide has both profanity and problematic content, largely aimed at women. We are going to focus a little closer on the expression to wear the pants in a family or relationship. I don't know what size screen you are using, but if you can read these images, the power dynamic represented is an extremely powerful one. So the one on the left uses this supposedly sophisticated man of the world, older man, appealing to women and kind of a playboy bachelor if you're my age, right? That's the way I read it. So he was used in a series of ads. I think it was for Dos Equis. And the meme says, I don't often admit my wife wears the pants because you already know that. So the idea is he's not nearly so suave and sophisticated as he's presented as being, or as he thinks of himself as being, because his wife wears the pants. She has a dominant role in their personal relationship. The next one says, she wears the pants and you don't think you're whipped. And that one, they left out part of the word. It's a little more vulgar than that. But the idea is that a man who lets a woman take the lead in a relationship, or sometimes even have an opinion in a relationship, is pussy whipped. The third one says, when you realize your wife wears the pants, and it has this man crying because he can't be a full man or a real man if his wife has a dominant role. The last one shows a man's lower legs with a skirt and high-heeled shoes, and it says, if she wears the pants, then you are wearing a skirt. Be a man, not a little bitch. Here, it's the first part, the pants skirt. Well, actually, I want you to think about the second part too, but I won't delve into it myself. I want you to think about the idea that if one person wears the pants, the other person has to wear the skirt. So there's a lot of meaning stuffed into pants and skirts there. Dockers created an advertising campaign entirely centered on the expression, wear the pants. You may need to enlarge these to read details on some of them, but all of these ads use the association of men and pants stored in the phrase, wear the pants, to link a certain description or image of man with the trousers they want to sell here. The ad on the lower left is the most straightforward about the message encoded in the text. It says at the beginning, once upon a time, men wore the pants and wore them well. Women rarely had to open doors, and Open doors here implies both literal doors and the figurative meaning of open doors as to move ahead and provide opportunity for others. The middle image here draws on class and race inequality to give a particular meaning to the phrase, "Face it, you're a man," that defines all men as having the similar character of not being women. The one on the right is ostensibly or supposedly about movies, but links to a particular construction of masculinity. It highlights words like hero, associates men with concepts like adventure and risk, for example, symbolized by sports cars. And I will leave it to you to decide whether placing the word action sliding down into the center waistband toward the crotch was deliberate on the part of the advertisers or not. By using this phrase, "wear the pants," and elaborating on it in this way, the advertising does not just count on cultural knowledge. It helps to create and reinforce that knowledge. The power of the expression "wear the pants" in the images I showed relies on associations that are part of our cultural knowledge, whether we want them or not. So we have here pants, male, power, better. These things are linked together. Pants is in opposition to skirt, male in opposition to female, and so on, so that you get skirt, female, vulnerability, less good. In order to get the memes and the advertisements, the viewer needs to know multiple layers of meaning folded into the expression "wear the pants." This is what I mean when I say that a word or expression does behind the scenes work. Getting the memes or the ads I showed relies on the viewer having the associations in the slide here form pretty much automatically in their minds, even if they're not aware of it, even if they would not be able to explain it, even if they can explain it but disagree completely. The reality of constantly adapting meanings linked to structures of power creates a challenge for historians who need to balance reading the past with not allowing their own historical context and assumptions to affect how they understand what they see. Historians build on the work of historians before them, so we need to evaluate that work by considering three contexts: our own historical context, the historical context of our subjects or what we're studying, and the historical context of our secondary or scholarly sources. This means that historians also look at the history of history, which is known as historiography. You do not need to remember the word historiography, but I do want you to keep in mind that history as a discipline is subject to historical context. I'm going to break the history of women's history into three parts. It is, of course, more complicated, as everything is, but this will help us see some patterns. Although these specialties in history have developed sequentially, this is a process of developing and adding, not completely replacing. There are now what I am calling standard historians, as well as social and cultural historians. The more historians approach a topic from different perspectives, the more likely we are to get closer to answers to historical questions. I am using standard history to designate branches of history that center on different areas, like political history, economic history, military history, that have been the focus of Western historians for a long time. If I were in one of those fields, I would not lump them all together. But Western women's history initially branched off at a time when these all shared a particular style or approach. I tend to characterize that approach as the great men and battles history, because the focus tended to be on men in positions of power and events that were associated with political or national changes. Historians, many of them women, started to ask more and more insistently, where were the women? They must have existed. The approach taken by these early women historians largely followed the great men and battles model. Women's historians looked at women in the past who appeared most closely associated with changes to things like politics, national boundaries, war, and so on. Basically, it was to find and study great women. You see this approach still reflected in celebrations of things like Women's History Month. There are articles on the specific women who reputedly broke boundaries or were the first at something. This alone, without other forms of history, tends to give the impression that women are continually entering a world that they only affect through what have been considered men's roles. It's a bit like having a picture and putting a woman into it without changing anything else. The social history approach started with questions like, we know about wealthy and powerful people, but what about everyone else? This is sometimes called a bottom-up approach. It focuses on the lives and experiences of people whose stories have not been told and retold, or even told at all. Social history is an approach that is used by many branches of history. Women's and gender history is just one of those. As social historians did more work, as they accumulated more data and information, the big question shifted from what was everyone else doing to how did these groups of people shape history? So for women's history, it would not just be adding women to the picture, but noticing how focusing on women changed the picture. Before I move on, I am going to point out the screamingly obvious because it reflects the reality of how different people who did the work of early women's history gained places in the university academic system overall. Everyone in the pictures I use here, we would classify as white. In reality, only some of the everyone else women were white. Interests have broadened from the end of the 20th century, but better is not enough, if for no other reason than that it produces flawed or incomplete historical analysis. Moving on. Cultural history started to ask questions like, why is there a category of woman at all? How does sorting people into men and women function in the power structures of society? Have people always been sorted the same way, or do the categories adjust over time in ways that continue to support a particular way of distributing power? Why two categories, men and women? The range of variation in humans does not really sort neatly into two categories. It's a bit like asking why an artist created a painting at all and why they used the medium that they did rather than just sticking women into it somewhere. You have a short piece by Nancy Cott, one of the major figures in the early development of women and gender history. She is discussing that development up to the time of publication, which is 1992, meaning that her piece is itself, the piece I've given you, a type of primary source. The Carol Vance article was written even earlier, in 1989, as social construction theory opened up new ways of looking at society and whole new sets of questions. The drawback of the Vance article is that social construction theory was in such early stages that she describes some parts in ways which are not accurate now. The positive to the Vance article is the insight it gives into the sorts of arguments and reflexive pushback that early scholars who used social construction theory had to deal with. We will be taking a closer look at social construction theory in the next lecture, so don't panic about it now. Panic about it then? No, don't panic at all. In the meantime, I want to place one thought in your head. Social construction is not about the way society structures individuals. That's nurture. Social construction is about the overarching society and the way that it is built or constructed. In other words, the social and social construction is what is being constructed, not what is doing the construction. And that brings us to part 3, problems with tradition and progress. These words do a lot of behind-the-scenes work. They tend to obscure the very questions that we want to look at in this class. Tradition and its forms, traditional, traditionally, are often used to mean that's the way it was before a particular change that I am interested in or annoyed by happened. But traditional for whom and for how long? The form of family that we often hear referred to as the traditional American family is also called the nuclear family, as opposed to, say, an extended family. The man, father, woman, mother, plus their children, neatly divided into sons and daughters, idea of family is a tradition that dates all the way back to, drumroll, the beginning of the Cold War after World War II. In other words, the 1950s. Traditional makes this family structure sound as if it has a long, deep, universal history, when in fact it does not. This works in part because the word family and some idea of what a family is does have older roots. People assume that family has always meant the same thing with the same exact specifics, but it's more like rubbers and pants. Progress has similar issues. What counts as progress for whom and why? What makes it progress? Progress also gives the idea of an inexorable current toward better, whatever better may be. But that's not actually the way that things work. In a large, comprehensive picture of human history, if only because what counts as better or progress is not the same for every person, in every time and place, and in regard to every possible aspect of life. When you are out in the larger world, you can use these terms, of course, but I would like you to avoid both of these words in your writing and actually in your discussion for this particular course. It will help you to be more historically clear and specific, and it will help you question things that might not have appeared questionable before. Key points for Lecture 3. Words, spoken or written, contain layers of meaning. Words and expressions also change meaning in all of those layers over time and space. The more historical context an historian knows, the more likely they are to interpret historical documents successfully. Historians must keep track of 3 historical contexts that can influence their interpretation of the past: the context of the time they are studying, their own historical context, and the historical context in which the secondary or scholarly sources that they use were written. The history of women's history reflects increasing awareness of the influence of the historian's own context. And we talked about standard history, that's my name, social history, cultural history, those are official names. The words tradition and progress and their variants tap into our cultural knowledge to do behind-the-scenes work that interferes with good historical practice. Do not use them in your writing or your discussion for this course. I will leave you to ponder this image with respect to our pants discussion. There is an image of a woman wearing a short pleated skirt and a black top and boots, and of a man with bare chest and a skirt. And the text reads, "Stop focusing on who wears the pants in a relationship. Relationships work best when no one is wearing pants." The poster tries to counter the pants, power, man associations that we've explored briefly in this lecture. It uses the method of flipping the script. Flipping here means reversing assumed gender roles, like the princess rescuing the dude in distress. You might use this poster as a jumping off point to consider. Does the messaging rely on the same assumptions that it challenges? Is it effective in making change? What other embedded cultural meanings appear in this poster, both in the text and in the imagery? There is no single correct answer here, which makes it far more interesting to consider these and other questions.